Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness echo through a lifetime in ways we never imagine. Margaret learned this truth at 73, when a forgotten photograph changed everything she thought she knew about her past. In the dusty attic of her childhood home, she found a picture of two children on a country path. A little girl was tying the shoelaces of an Amish boy while other kids watched. She remembered that day clearly now, how the children had laughed when Samuel's laces came undone, how she'd quietly helped him without thinking twice. Samuel disappeared from their small town shortly after. His family moved away without explanation. For 58 years, Margaret wondered what became of the shy boy who'd thanked her with such grateful eyes. Now, caring for her dying sister, she felt drawn to find him. Something told her that discovering Samuel's story might help her understand her own life's meaning. What she would learn about the quiet Amish boy would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret had never planned to return to Millbrook. The small Ohio town held too many memories. Too many ghosts of a simpler time that felt foreign to the life she'd built in Cleveland. For 47 years, she'd been a city woman teaching high school English, raising 3 children with her late husband David, watching grandchildren grow up in suburban comfort. Millbrook was a chapter she'd closed long ago, but Ruth's diagnosis changed everything. The call had come on a Tuesday morning in March. Dr. Patterson's voice, gentle but firm, through the phone line. "Your sister needs full-time care now, Mrs. Chun. The cancer has progressed faster than we hoped. She's asking for you." Ruth, stubborn and independent to her core, had waited until the very end to admit she couldn't manage alone. At 71, she was 2 years younger than Margaret, but had always been the fighter, the one who stayed behind to care for their aging parents while Margaret pursued her teaching career in the city. Now the roles were reversed, and Margaret found herself packing a suitcase for what she assumed would be a few weeks, just long enough to help Ruth get her affairs in order. The drive from Cleveland to Millbrook took 3 hours through rolling farmland that grew increasingly familiar as the miles passed. Spring was trying to assert itself across the countryside, with pale green shoots pushing through the dark soil and trees beginning to show the faintest hint of buds. The landscape triggered memories Margaret had thought were safely buried: bicycle rides down gravel roads, the smell of fresh-cut hay, the sound of wind rustling through corn stalks taller than her 10-year-old head. Millbrook looked smaller than she remembered, as childhood places always do. Main Street still boasted the same brick storefronts, though half were empty now, their windows reflecting the cloudy sky like vacant eyes. The old Woolworths had become a thrift store and a movie theater where she'd seen her first film now. Sold antiques. Progress, she supposed, though it felt more like gentle decay. Ruth's house, their family home, sat on Elm Street, just as Margaret remembered it. The white clapboard siding needed fresh paint, and the front porch sagged slightly on one side, but the lilac bushes their mother had planted were already showing purple buds. Margaret sat in her car for a long moment, gathering strength for what lay ahead. The front door opened before she could knock. Ruth appeared in the doorway, thinner than Margaret had ever seen her, her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. Despite the illness ravaging her body, Ruth's blue eyes still held their familiar spark of determination. "Don't you dare look at me like I'm dying," Ruth said by way of greeting, though her voice carried less strength than her words suggested. "I wasn't planning to," Margaret replied, stepping forward to embrace her sister carefully. Ruth felt fragile. In her arms, bird-like bones beneath a soft cardigan. "Though you could use some meat on those bones." "That's why I have you for now," Ruth said, managing a small smile. "Come in, I've got coffee on." The interior of the house was a time capsule. The same floral wallpaper lined the hallway, now slightly faded. Their mother's china cabinet still displayed the good dishes they'd saved for special occasions that rarely came. Even the smell was unchanged, a mixture of lavender sachets, old wood, and something indefinably homey that Margaret had forgotten existed. They settled in the kitchen, where afternoon sunlight streamed through gingham curtains onto the worn linoleum floor. Ruth moved carefully, her breathing slightly labored, but she insisted on serving the coffee herself. Margaret watched her sister's deliberate movements and felt a pang of guilt. How long had Ruth been struggling alone while Margaret lived her comfortable city life? "Dr. Patterson says you have questions," Ruth said, settling into the chair across from Margaret. "I suppose you want to know about treatments, timelines, all that clinical business." "Only if you want to discuss it," Margaret sighed carefully. She'd learned over the years that Ruth responded better to gentle approaches than direct confrontation. Ruth sipped her coffee, studying Margaret over the rim of her cup. 6 months, maybe less. The cancer's in my liver now, and at my age, the aggressive treatments would just make me miserable without changing the outcome much. I'd rather spend whatever time I have left in my own home with my faculties intact." Margaret nodded, though her throat felt tight. Ruth had always been practical about difficult things, facing them head-on while Margaret tended to worry and overthink. "What do you need from me?" "Company, mostly. Help with the shopping and cleaning. Someone to drive me to appointments when I can't manage it myself." Ruth paused, her expression softening. "I know this isn't easy for you, coming back. Here, you made your escape, built your own life. I never held that against you." "It wasn't an escape," Margaret protested, though even as she said it, she wondered if that was entirely true. Wasn't it? Ruth's eyes held a knowing look. "You couldn't wait to leave Millbrook behind, to get out to the wider world." I understood that this place can feel small when you're young and full of dreams. Margaret looked around the familiar kitchen, feeling the weight of her sister's words. Had she been running from something all those years ago? Or simply running towards something better? "I'll stay as long as you need me," she said finally. "I was hoping you'd say that." Ruth reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. "There's something peaceful about having family close when the end comes. I'm grateful you're here." That evening, after Ruth had retired early with visible exhaustion, Margaret found herself alone in the house of her childhood. She wandered from room to room, taking inventory of a life frozen in time. Ruth had changed very little since their parents' deaths 20 years earlier. The same furniture occupied the same spaces. The same photographs lined the mantelpiece. The same books filled the shelves in the living room. It was while exploring the upstairs bedrooms that Margaret discovered the pull-down ladder to the attic. She hadn't been up there in decades, but curiosity drew her upward into the dusty space under the eaves. A single bare bulb provided weak illumination for the accumulated treasures and cast-offs of 3 generations. Boxes labeled in her mother's careful handwriting contained Christmas decorations, old clothes, and school memorabilia. Margaret found herself drawn to a trunk marked children's things that held report cards, artwork, and school photographs spanning her and Ruth's elementary years. The musty smell of old paper and forgotten time filled her nostrils as she sorted through the memories. That's when she found it. The photograph was tucked between the pages of an old scrapbook, its edges slightly yellowed, but the image still clear. 2 children on a dirt path, surrounded by the golden light of autumn. A little girl with dark pigtails knelt beside a boy in simple dark clothes, her hands busy with his shoelaces. Other children stood in the background, their faces showing. The cruel amusement of childhood mockery. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She remembered this moment with sudden, vivid clarity. The way Samuel Yoder had stood so still while she worked, his face flushed with embarrassment and gratitude. The way the other children had laughed when his laces came undone during recess, calling him clumsy, different, strange. The way she'd step forward without thinking, kneeling in the dust to help him while the others watched. Samuel Yoder. She hadn't thought of him in years, but now his memory came flooding back with startling intensity. The quiet Amish boy who joined their class briefly in the fall of 1967 when she was 11 years old. He'd been different from the other children, not just because of his plain clothes and formal manner of speaking, but because of something deeper. A gentleness, a thoughtfulness that set him apart from the rough-and-tumble energy of their rural classroom. Margaret studied the photograph more closely, trying to read the expressions captured in that long-ago moment. Samuel's face showed vulnerability, yes, but also something else. Trust, perhaps. As if her simple act of kindness had meant more to him than she could have understood at 11 years old. What had happened to Samuel Yoder? The question formed in her mind with surprising urgency. He'd been in their class for only a few months before disappearing as suddenly as he'd arrived. One day he was there, sitting quietly at his desk, and the next day his seat was empty. Mrs. Henderson had simply announced that the Yoder family had moved away, offering no explanation for their sudden departure. Margaret realized she was trembling slightly as she held the photograph. Why should a picture of a childhood acquaintance affect her so strongly? Perhaps it was being back in this house, surrounded by memories and the weight of her sister's mortality. Or perhaps it was something more, a recognition that small moments, seemingly insignificant at the time, might carry more meaning than she'd ever imagined. She climbed down from the attic with the photograph clutched carefully in her hand, her mind churning with questions. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of water and sat at the table, studying the image under the bright overhead light. The girl in the picture looked determined, focused on her simple task of helping another child. Had she known, even then, that kindness mattered? Had Samuel known? Outside, the evening settled over Millbrook with the quiet that only small towns knew. Margaret could hear the distant sound of a train whistle, probably the freight line that still ran through the county, carrying goods to larger, more important places. The sound made her feel suddenly isolated, as if she were the only person awake in a sleeping world. Ruth's medical records lay in a neat stack on the counter, a reminder of why Margaret was here. Dr. Patterson had been thorough in his documentation, but the essential facts were simple and stark. Ruth was dying, and Margaret was here to help her do it with dignity. It should have been enough to focus on this final gift to her sister, but the photograph had awakened something else entirely. A curiosity about roads not taken, people not followed up on, kindnesses given and then forgotten. What had become of Samuel Yoder? Had he thought of her over the years, or had that moment on the dusty path been as forgettable for him as it had seemed to be for her? Margaret found herself wondering if finding Samuel might somehow help her understand her own life better. She'd always been proud of her teaching career, of the thousands of students she'd influenced over the years. But had she really made a difference? Had any of her efforts to help and guide young people mattered in the long run? The photograph suggested that perhaps even the smallest gestures could have lasting impact. If that were true, then maybe her life had more meaning than she sometimes feared. In her quieter moments of doubt, as she prepared for bed in her childhood room, Margaret made a decision. Tomorrow she would begin asking questions about Samuel Yoder, not because she had any illusion of rekindling a childhood friendship, but because she sensed that finding out what happened to him might help her understand something important about the power of human connection. The photograph sat on her nightstand as she settled under her mother's old quilt. In the darkness, Margaret could almost hear the echo of children's laughter from that long-ago autumn day, and beneath it, the quiet voice of a boy saying, "Thank you," with more feeling than such simple words usually carried. She fell asleep wondering if Samuel Yoder had ever married, had children, found happiness in whatever life he'd built after leaving Millbrook. Most of all, She wondered if he remembered a little girl who'd knelt in the dust to tie his shoelaces while other children watched and laughed up tomorrow. She decided she would begin to find out. Margaret woke the next morning with the photograph, still vivid in her mind. Ruth was already up, moving carefully around the kitchen, her breathing slightly labored, but her determination intact. They shared breakfast in companionable silence, Ruth seeming to understand that her sister needed time to process her return to Millbrook. "I thought I'd drive around town today," Margaret said as she cleared their dishes. "Reacquaint myself with the place. Maybe stop by the old school." Ruth looked up from her second cup of coffee, studying Margaret's face. Looking for something specific or just taking a trip down memory lane? Margaret hesitated. She hadn't planned to mention the photograph yet, but Ruth had always been perceptive. "I found something in the attic last night. A picture from when we were children. It brought back some memories I'd forgotten." Memories have a way of doing that when you come home, Ruth said gently. "Sometimes that's why people stay away. Too much remembering can be overwhelming." After ensuring Ruth was comfortable with her morning routine, Margaret set out for downtown Millbrook. The spring air carried the scent of fresh earth and budding trees, a smell that transported her instantly to childhood mornings walking to school. She drove slowly down familiar streets, noting which houses remained unchanged and which had been renovated or abandoned. The old elementary school building had indeed been converted to a community center, just as Mrs. Henley had mentioned in her Christmas cards over the years. Mrs. Henley, now 86, and somehow still the town's unofficial keeper of local history, had written faithfully to Ruth every holiday, updating her on births, deaths, and the slow evolution of small-town life. Margaret parked in front of the red brick building and sat for a moment, gathering courage. The playground equipment had been updated, but the building itself looked much the same as it had in 1967. She could almost see 11-year-old children racing across the yard during recess. Their voices carried on the wind out inside. The community center buzzed with quiet activity. A quilting circle occupied one corner of what had been the gymnasium, their needles flashing in the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. The smell of coffee and something freshly baked drifted from what Margaret remembered as the principal's office. "Margaret Patricia Callahan," a familiar voice called out. "I know that walk anywhere, even after all these years." Margaret turned to see Mrs. Henley approaching, her white hair carefully permed, her blue eyes bright with curiosity behind wire-rimmed glasses. Despite her age, she moved with the brisk efficiency Margaret remembered from childhood. "Mrs. Henley," Margaret said, accepting the older woman's embrace. "You look wonderful. I look old, but I'm still breathing, which is more than many can say at my age." Mrs. Henley stepped back, studying Margaret's face. "Ruth told me you might be coming back. To help her. I'm glad. She needs family now." They settled in the center's small kitchen with coffee and homemade oatmeal cookies. Mrs. Henley had volunteered at the community center since its opening, organizing activities and maintaining the building's small historical archive. She was, Margaret realized, exactly the person to ask about Samuel Yoder. "I was hoping you might remember some of the children from my class," Margaret began carefully. "There was a boy who joined us briefly in the fall of 1967, Samuel Yoder, an Amish boy." Mrs. Henley's expression shifted, becoming more thoughtful. "Samuel Yoder. Yes, I remember him well. Quiet child, very polite. His family lived out past Miller's farm for a few months." She paused, stirring her coffee slowly. "It didn't end well for them here." "What do you mean?" "There was some trouble at the end. Money went missing from the church fund. Not a large amount, but enough to cause a stir in a small community. Samuel's father, Jacob, had been doing carpentry work around town, including some repairs at the church. When the money disappeared, suspicion fell on him." Mrs. Henley shook her head sadly. People can be quick to judge when someone's different, especially when times are hard. Margaret felt a chill run through her. Was he guilty? I never believed. So, Jacob Yoder was an honest man, skilled with his hands and devoted to his family. But perception became reality, as it often does. The family left town quietly one night, probably to avoid further trouble. Do you know where they went? Mrs. Henley stood and moved to a filing cabinet in the corner. I might have something that can help. She pulled out a thick folder marked School Records 196-71968 and began sorting through yellowed papers. Here we are. She handed Margaret a manila folder containing Samuel's school records. The documents were brief, but revealing enrollment. Forms showing his previous address as a farm outside Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and his father's occupation listed as carpenter and furniture maker. Samuel's grades were excellent across all subjects, and there was a note from his teacher praising his artwork and quiet leadership among the younger children. He was only with us for 3 months, Mrs. Henley said, settling back in her chair. But I remember him making quite an impression. Very mature for his age, and talented with his hands like his father. He helped the younger children during art class, always patient and encouraging. Margaret studied the enrollment form, noting the careful handwriting and official stamps. These records might help me track down what happened to the family. May I ask why you're looking for him? Mrs. Henley's question was gentle but direct. Margaret pulled the photograph from her purse and placed it on the table between them. Mrs. Henley's eyes widened as she recognized the scene. Oh my, she said softly. I remember this day. It was during recess, and some of the children were being particularly cruel about Samuel's appearance. You stepped in to help him. She looked up at Margaret with approval. It was a kind thing to do. I'd forgotten about it until I found this picture last night. But seeing it again, I can't stop thinking about what happened to him. Whether he's happy, whether his family recovered from whatever drove them away from here. Mrs. Henley nodded slowly. Sometimes the past calls to us when we need to understand something about ourselves. Perhaps finding Samuel will help you process your own return to Millbrook. They talked for another hour, with Mrs. Henley sharing more memories of Samuel's brief time in town. He had been exceptional in mathematics and showed remarkable skill in art class, creating detailed drawings that impressed even the adults. Several teachers had commented on his maturity and kindness toward other children, particularly those who were shy or struggling. He was the kind of child who would grow into a good man, Mrs. Henley said as Margaret prepared to leave. I always hoped he found a place where his gentle nature was appreciated rather than seen as weakness. Margaret drove home with Samuel's school records on the passenger seat, her mind churning with new questions. The story of the missing money troubled her deeply. How devastating it must have been for a proud family to be driven away by false accusations. How confusing and frightening for an 11-year-old boy to suddenly lose his home and friends through no fault of his own. That evening, she shared her discoveries with Ruth, who listened with growing concern. I remember hearing whispers about that incident, Ruth said slowly. Father was involved in the church board meetings around that time. There was a lot of anger, a lot of finger-pointing. Do you think Father believed Samuel's family was guilty? Ruth was quiet for a long moment, staring into her teacup. Father had his prejudices, Margaret. He wasn't comfortable with people who were different, whether it was religion or race or just ways of living he didn't understand. I'm ashamed to say it probably didn't take much to convince him that the Amish family was responsible. Margaret felt a sick feeling in her stomach. Had her own family been part of the injustice that drove Samuel away? The thought was almost too painful to consider, but she knew she needed to pursue the truth, whatever it might reveal. I'm going to try to find him, she said finally. I need to know what happened to Samuel Yoder. Ruth reached across the table and covered Margaret's hand with her own. Be prepared for what you might learn. Sometimes, the past holds more pain than we remember. That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about 11-year-old Samuel sitting alone in an unfamiliar classroom, trying to fit in while carrying the weight of his family's shame. She thought about the kindness she'd shown him that day on the playground, such a small gesture, yet perhaps one of the few bright moments in what must have been a difficult time. She was determined now to find out what had become of the quiet Amish boy who had thanked her with such heartfelt gratitude for something as simple as tying his shoelaces. Whatever it took, wherever the search led her, she would discover the truth about Samuel Yoder's story. The next morning brought a gentle rain that drummed against the windows of the old house. Ruth was having a difficult day, the pain medication making her groggy and disoriented. Margaret spent the morning helping her sister with basic tasks, but her mind kept returning to Samuel Yoder and the injustice his family had suffered. After Ruth settled in for an afternoon nap, Margaret decided to visit the Amish settlement that still existed on the outskirts of Millbrook. If Samuel's family had connections to the local Amish community, someone might remember them or know what had become of them after they left town. The drive took her through farmland that had changed little over the decades. Rolling hills stretched toward the horizon, dotted with red barns and white farmhouses. As she approached the settlement, Margaret could see horses and buggies moving along the roads, and children playing in yards where laundry hung on lines, strung between trees. She stopped at a small furniture workshop where the sign indicated custom carpentry was available. The building was simple but well-maintained, with large windows that let in natural light. Inside, the scent of freshly cut wood filled the air, as she could hear the steady rhythm of hand tools being used with practiced skill. An elderly Amish man emerged from the back of the workshop, wiping his hands on a leather apron. His beard was white, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent a lifetime working with his hands. He regarded Margaret with polite curiosity. "Good afternoon," she said. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work. I'm looking for information about a family that used to live in this area. The Yoder family, Jacob, his wife, and their son Samuel." The man's expression became more guarded. "I am Jacob Miller," he said in accented English. "I knew Jacob Yoder." "Yes. What is your interest in this family?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "Samuel was a classmate of mine many years ago, when we were children. I recently learned that his family left Millbrook under difficult circumstances, and I wanted to understand what happened to them." Jacob Miller studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust her. Finally, he gestured toward two simple wooden chairs near his workbench. "Sit, please." It has been many years since anyone asked about the Yoder family. They settled into the chairs, and Jacob's weathered hands folded in his lap. Jacob Yoder was a good man, a skilled carpenter. When his family came here from Pennsylvania, we welcomed them. He was seeking a fresh start, he said, after some troubles in his home community. What kind of troubles? Jacob's brother had fallen into gambling, borrowed money he could not repay. When debts came due, there was pressure on the whole family. Jacob brought his wife and son here, hoping for a quiet life, honest work. Jacob shook his head sadly. The peace did not find them here. Margaret felt her heart sink. "Because of the missing church money. You know of this?" Jacob's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I heard about it yesterday. I was told that suspicion fell on Jacob." Jacob's face darkened with old anger. Jacob Yoder never stole anything in his life. He was a man of faith, devoted to his family and his craft. But when money went missing from the English church, people were quick to blame the outsider, the one who was different. "Do you know who actually took the money?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, his hands working at a piece of sandpaper, as if the familiar motion helped him think. "There were rumors," he said finally. "Talk among our people about who had gambling debts, who was seen in places where such things happen. But we do not speak against our English neighbors, even when they speak against us. Margaret leaned forward. Slightly. Mr. Miller, what can you tell me about Samuel? What kind of boy was he? Jacob's expression softened immediately. Samuel was special, quiet, but wise beyond his years. He had a gift with his hands like his father, but also with words, with drawing. He made friends easily among our children, despite being new. He paused, remembering. The boy carried much worry for one so young. He felt responsible for his family's troubles, though none of it was his fault. Did you know him well? My grandson. David was Samuel's age. They became close friends during the months the Yoder family lived here. Samuel helped David with his English lessons, and David taught Samuel about farming. It was good for both boys. Jacob stood and moved to an old wooden chest in the corner of the workshop. He pulled out a leather-bound book and returned to his chair, opening it carefully. This is our church registry, he explained. It records the families who have been part of our community. He turned to a page near the middle and pointed to an entry written in careful script. Margaret could see Jacob Yoder listed along with his wife, Rebecca, and son, Samuel, along with dates marking their arrival and departure from the community. They were with us from August through November of 1967, Jacob said. Jacob did beautiful work furniture, repairs, whatever was needed. Rebecca helped with quilting and cooking for community gatherings. Samuel attended our school and made good progress in his studies. What happened when they left? Jacob's face grew somber. Jacob came to me the night before they departed. He was heartbroken, angry at the accusations, but more concerned for his family's safety. Some of the Englishmen had been drinking, making threats. Jacob feared for Rebecca and Samuel. Margaret felt sick. They were threatened? Not directly, but the anger was growing. Jacob was wise to leave when he did. Jacob closed the registry book carefully. He told me they would go west, perhaps to Ohio's Amish communities near Holmes County, or maybe further to Indiana or Iowa. He wanted to get far enough away that the rumors could not follow them. Did you ever hear from them again? No direct word, but several years later, a traveling minister mentioned meeting a carpenter named Jacob Yoder in Indiana. The description seemed to match, a man with a gentle manner and a talented son. I hoped it was them, starting fresh where they could find peace. Margaret absorbed this information, feeling the weight of her family's community's injustice pressing down on her. Mr. Miller, I believe Samuel's family was innocent of the theft. I want to find them, to somehow make amends for what happened here. Jacob studied her face intently. Why does this matter to you so much? It was long ago, and you were just a child. Margaret told him about the photograph, about the moment of kindness she'd shared with Samuel, and about her growing need to understand how that brief friendship had affected both their lives. Jacob listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. Sometimes, he said when she finished, God puts people in our path to teach us about kindness or forgiveness or justice. Perhaps finding Samuel is something you need to do not just for him, but for your own soul. As Margaret prepared to leave, Jacob asked her to wait. He disappeared into the back of the workshop and returned with a small wooden toy, a horse carved from light-colored wood, its features delicate and detailed. Samuel made this during his time with us, Jacob said, placing it in Margaret's hands. He'd carved several toys for the younger children, always thinking of others before himself. David kept this one all these years, but I think Samuel would want you to have it now. Margaret turned the wooden horse over in her hands, marveling at the craftsmanship. For an 11-year-old boy to create something so beautiful spoke to both talent and patience far beyond his years. Thank you, she said softly. This means more than you know. As she drove home through the gentle rain, Margaret clutched the wooden horse in her hand, feeling a tangible connection to the boy who had carved it with such care. The search for Samuel Yoder was becoming more than just a quest for information. It was becoming a journey toward understanding the far-reaching consequences of both kindness and cruelty, and her own role in both. The wooden horse sat on Margaret's knit-stand. That evening, catching the lamplight and casting small shadows on the wall, Ruth had admired the craftsmanship when Margaret showed it to her, running her thin fingers over the smooth curves with appreciation. Remarkable work for a child, Ruth had said. He must have had a real gift. Now, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself drawn back to the photograph and the new information Jacob Miller had provided. Samuel's family had been driven away by false accusations, their reputation destroyed by prejudice and fear. The injustice of it burned in her chest, making sleep seem impossible. The next morning brought clearer weather, and Margaret decided to explore the places where Samuel might have spent time during his brief stay in Millbrook. After ensuring Ruth was comfortable with her morning medication and breakfast, she set out for Willow Creek, the meandering stream that ran behind a school property. As a child, Margaret had often played along the creek banks with her classmates, building dams with stones and searching for crawfish in the shallow pools. It was a place where children could escape adult supervision and create their own adventures. If Samuel had been like other 11-year-olds, he would have been drawn to the water and the freedom it represented. The path to the creek was overgrown now, used more by deer than children. Margaret pushed through brambles and emerging spring vegetation following the faint trail she remembered from decades past. The sound of running water grew louder as she approached, and soon she could see the creek sparkling in the morning sunlight. The old oak tree was still there, massive and gnarled, its trunk scarred by time and countless carved initials. Margaret had forgotten about this tree until she saw it again, how it had served as a landmark and gathering place for the local children. She approached it slowly, memories flooding back of summer afternoons spent in its shade. Something caught her eye in the deep hollow where the tree's roots emerged from the earth. A small depression, partially hidden by fallen leaves and debris, but clearly artificial. Margaret knelt and carefully cleared away the natural cover, revealing what appeared to be a child's hiding place. Inside the hollow, wrapped in what had once been oil paper but was now brittle and yellowed, she found a collection of small items. Her hands trembled as she carefully extracted them. A few marbles, a pocket knife with a carved handle, and most remarkably, a folded piece of paper that had somehow survived the decades. Margaret unfolded the paper with infinite care, afraid it might crumble at her touch. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, clearly that of a child who had been taught to write with precision. As she read, her breath caught in her throat. "Dear Margaret," the letter began, "I am writing this because I do not know if I will see you again before we leave. Father says we must go soon, and I am scared about what will happen to us." Margaret sat back against the oak tree, her heart pounding as she continued reading. "I want you to know that what you did for me that day when the other children were laughing was the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me outside my family. I know it was just tying my shoelaces, but it meant more than you could know. When you knelt down beside me, you looked at me like I was a real person, not just someone strange and different. I have been thinking about why some people are kind and others are cruel. I think maybe kindness is something that grows inside a person like a seed, and when you show it to someone else, you plant a seed in them too. I hope someday I can plant seeds of kindness like you did for me. Father is worried about the trouble at the church. He says people think we took money that was not ours, but we would never do such a thing. Mother cries at night when she thinks I am sleeping. I do not understand why people would rather believe something bad about us than try to know who we really are. If we have to leave, I want you to know that I will never forget your kindness. I will carry it with me wherever we go, and I will try to be kind to other people the way you were kind to me. I made something for you, but I was too shy to give it to you. I will leave it here in my secret place, and maybe someday you will find it. I hope when you do, you will remember that small acts of kindness are like pebbles thrown into a pond. The ripples go much farther than you can see. Your friend Samuel Yoder. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as she finished reading. The letter was dated just 3 days before the Yoder family had left Millbrook. Samuel had poured his young heart onto this paper, expressing thoughts far beyond his years about kindness, injustice, and human nature. She looked back into the hollow and found what Samuel had left for her, another wooden carving. This one, even more delicate than the horse Jacob Miller had given her. It was a small bird, a robin, perhaps, with its wings spread as if caught in the moment of taking flight. Every feather was carefully detailed, every curve of the body shaped with love and patience. Margaret held the carved bird up to the sunlight, marveling at the skill Samuel had possessed even as a child. But more than the craftsmanship, she was moved by the thought of him working on this gift in secret, pouring his gratitude and hope into something beautiful he might never have the courage to give directly. The implications of the letter settled over her like a heavy blanket. Samuel's family had been innocent, just as Jacob Miller had insisted. They had been driven away by suspicion and prejudice, their lives disrupted by false accusations. And somewhere in all of this injustice, her own family had played a role. Margaret remembered her father's involvement in church affairs, his position on various committees and boards. Had he been among those who had pointed fingers at the Yoder family? Had he helped create the atmosphere of suspicion that ultimately drove them away? The thought made her feel sick. All these years, she had carried the memory of that simple act of kindness as a source of quiet pride. Now she understood that while she had shown compassion to Samuel as an individual, her family and community had shown him cruelty as a group. The contradiction was almost too painful to bear. She carefully rewrapped Samuel's letter and carving in her jacket and made her way back to the car. The wooden bird felt warm in her hands, as if it still carried some of the love with which it had been carved. Samuel's words echoed in her mind. Small acts of kindness are like pebbles thrown into a pond. The ripples go much farther than you can see. If that was true, then what kind of ripples had the community's cruelty created? What had happened to Samuel's faith in human goodness after experiencing such injustice at such a young age? Had he been able to maintain his generous spirit, or had the hurt changed him in fundamental ways? Back at home, Margaret found Ruth sitting in the sunroom, reading a mystery novel with a magnifying glass. Her sister looked up as Margaret entered, immediately sensing something significant had happened. "You found something," Ruth said, setting down her book. Margaret showed her the letter and the carved bird, watching Ruth's face as she read Samuel's heartfelt words. When Ruth finished, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Oh, Margaret," she said softly, "that poor child. To carry such wisdom and such pain at 11 years old. Ruth, I need to know more about what Father's role was in all this. Was he involved in accusing the Yoder family?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. Finally, she sighed deeply. "I think it's time I told you some things I've carried for too many years." Ruth's confession hung in the air between them like a storm cloud. Margaret set down the carved bird carefully on the coffee table and settled into the chair across from her sister, preparing herself for whatever painful truth was about to emerge. Father was on the church board when the money went missing. Ruth began slowly, her voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets. $50 from the building fund, not a fortune, but enough to matter to a small church in 1967. Margaret nodded, encouraging her sister to continue. The theft happened during a church supper when people were coming and going freely. The money box was left unattended for periods while the board members served food and cleaned up. Anyone could have taken it. Ruth paused, adjusting her position. to ease the pain that was always present now. But Father and some of the other board members immediately suspected Jacob Yoder. Because he was different, Margaret said, feeling anger rise in her chest. Because he was convenient, Ruth corrected sadly. Father had never been comfortable with outsiders, especially those whose religious practices he didn't understand. When suspicion needed a target, Jacob became the obvious choice. Ruth stood carefully and moved to the old secretary desk that had belonged to their mother. She pulled out a small key and unlocked one of the drawers, withdrawing a manila envelope. Yellowed with age. "I found this among Father's papers after he died," she said, returning to her chair with the envelope. "I should have shown it to you years ago, but I was ashamed of what it revealed about our family." Margaret's hand shook slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside were several documents, meeting minutes from the church board, notes in her father's handwriting, and most damning of all, a letter from another board member expressing doubts about Jacob Yoder's guilt. The letter was from Thomas Peterson, a man Margaret remembered as one of her father's closest friends. In careful script, Thomas had written, "Harold, I must express my concerns about our handling of the Yoder situation. I have spoken with several witnesses who saw young Billy Crawford near the money box during the evening in question. Billy has been in trouble before for taking things that don't belong to him. I believe we should investigate this possibility before taking any action against Jacob Yoder." Margaret looked up at Ruth with growing horror. They had evidence pointing to someone else? Billy Crawford was the son of one of the most prominent families in town. His father owned the hardware store and was a major contributor to the church. Ruth's voice was bitter. It was easier to blame the outsider than to confront the possibility that one of their own children was responsible. Margaret flipped through the other documents, finding more evidence of her father's role in the injustice. His meeting notes showed a clear bias against Jacob Yoder from the beginning, dismissing character witnesses and focusing only on opportunity rather than evidence. Did Father ever acknowledge that he might have been wrong? Ruth shook her head. He took it to his grave. I think part of him knew, especially after Billy Crawford was arrested for embezzlement in his 20s. But Father could never admit to being wrong about something so important. Margaret felt as if the foundations of her childhood were crumbling. Her father, whom she had always seen as a man of principle, had been willingly blind to evidence that contradicted his prejudices. How many other injustices had she overlooked or forgotten? "There's more," Ruth said quietly. She pulled out a final document, a bank record showing a deposit made to Billy Crawford's account 3 days after the church money disappeared. The amount was $50. Billy deposited the exact amount that was stolen? His father made the deposit, claiming it was Billy's allowance money. But the timing was suspicious, and when Thomas Peterson tried to bring this to the board's attention, Father and the others shut him down. Margaret stared at the bank record, feeling sick. The evidence of Billy Crawford's guilt was overwhelming, yet the church board had chosen to pursue Jacob Yoder instead. The injustice was breathtaking in its deliberate blindness. What happened to Billy Crawford eventually? He lived here until his mid-20s, getting into increasingly serious trouble. Shoplifting, writing bad checks, petty theft. His father always bailed him out, made restitution, kept him out of jail. Ruth's expression was grim. Eventually, Billy moved to Columbus and was arrested for embezzling from his employer. He served 2 years in prison. Margaret thought about Samuel's letter, his innocent faith that people would choose to know the truth rather than believe comfortable lies. The reality was so much more painful than his young heart could have imagined. Ruth, did anyone in town ever express doubts about the Yoder family's guilt? A few people quietly. Mrs. Henderson at the school was one of them. She knew Samuel was a good boy and couldn't believe his family would steal. But those voices were drowned out by the majority who found it easier to blame strangers. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where she had grown up. How many other families had suffered because of this community's prejudices? How many other Samuel Yoders had been driven away by fear and ignorance? "I have to find him," she said finally. "I have to tell him the truth about what happened, about who really stole that money. Margaret, it was 58 years ago. Samuel has probably built a life far from here, far from these painful memories. Are you sure it's wise to dredge up the past?" Margaret turned back to her sister, her resolve strengthening. Samuel wrote in his letter that he hoped to plant seeds of kindness like I had shown him. What if learning the truth helps him understand that not everyone in Millbrook was cruel? What if it helps him heal from wounds he's carried all these years? Ruth studied her sister's face, recognizing the stubborn determination that had always driven Margaret to fight for her students and causes she believed in. Then we need to find more recent information about Samuel or his family. The trail from 1967 is probably too cold to follow. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude that Ruth had said we. Despite her illness, her sister was offering to help with the search. "I was thinking of visiting some of the Amish communities in Holmes County," Margaret said. Jacob Miller mentioned that a traveling minister might have encountered Samuel's family there. "That's a start. But you should also try the internet, genealogy websites, public records. People leave traces wherever they go, especially if they've been successful in business or involved in their communities." Margaret nodded, already planning her next steps. Samuel Yoder had been wronged by her community and possibly by her own family. The least she could do was try to set the record straight, to offer the apology and acknowledgement of innocence that his family had never received. That evening, as Margaret helped Ruth prepare for bed, her sister gripped her hand tightly. "I'm proud of you for pursuing this," Ruth said. "Father made a terrible mistake, and our family should bear some responsibility for making it right." Margaret squeezed her sister's hand in return. "It's the right thing to do. Samuel deserves to know the truth." As she settled into bed that night, Margaret found herself wondering what kind of man Samuel had become. Had the injustice he experienced as a child made him cynical and hard, or had he somehow maintained the gentle wisdom she remembered? Tomorrow, she would begin the search in earnest, following whatever trail might lead her to the boy who had carved a bird with such hope and given it to a friend he might never see again. Margaret spent the next week dividing her time between caring for Ruth and conducting an increasingly intensive search for Samuel Yoder. She had contacted several Amish communities in Ohio and Indiana, visited genealogy websites, and even hired a private investigator who specialized in finding people who had changed their names or moved frequently. Ruth's condition was gradually worsening, with more difficult days than good ones, but she remained alert and interested in Margaret's progress. They had developed a routine where Margaret would share her daily discoveries over evening tea, and Ruth would offer suggestions or insights based on her own memories of the time period. On a warm May morning, Margaret's investigator called with promising news. He had found records of a Jacob Yoder who had purchased a farm in Holmes County, Ohio, in 1968, just months after the Millbrook incident. The property had been sold in 1985, but the investigator had tracked down neighbors who remembered the family. They were good people, the investigator reported. Jacob was known throughout the area as an exceptional carpenter and furniture maker. He built custom pieces for wealthy families from Columbus and Cleveland. The family was well respected in their community. "What about Samuel?" Margaret asked, her heart racing. This is where it gets interesting. Samuel left the Amish faith when he turned 18, which apparently caused some family conflict. He took the name Sam Yoder professionally and moved to Columbus to attend Ohio State University. He graduated with degrees in both business and art. Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and sadness. Samuel had clearly succeeded academically, but leaving his family's faith must have been painful for everyone involved. Do you have any current information about him? I'm still working on that. Sam Yoder is a fairly common name, and he seems to have been deliberately private about his past. But I have some leads I'm following. After the call, Margaret decided to drive to Holmes County herself. She wanted to see the place where Samuel's family had rebuilt their lives after the injustice in Millbrook. The 3-hour drive through central Ohio gave her time to think about what she hoped to accomplish by finding Samuel. The Holmes County countryside was beautiful in late spring, with rolling hills covered in green fields and forests. Amish farms dotted the landscape, their neat buildings and well-tended gardens speaking to a way of life that valued simplicity and hard work. Margaret could understand why Samuel's family had found peace here after their ordeal. She stopped at a furniture store in Millersburg that featured handcrafted Amish pieces. The owner, an elderly man named David Schlabach, remembered Jacob Yoder well. Jacob was one of the finest craftsmen I ever knew, David said, running his hands over a dining table that bore Jacob's distinctive joinery techniques. He could would do things that seemed impossible. Very patient, very precise. His son had the same gift. You knew Samuel? Sam, yes. Remarkable young man, though it broke his father's heart when he left the faith. David's expression grew thoughtful. Sam was caught between two worlds. He had his father's hands, but a mind that craved education and opportunities the Amish life couldn't provide. David led Margaret to the back of the store, where several pieces from Jacob's workshop were displayed. Each piece was a work of art: chairs with graceful curves, cabinets with intricate inlay work, tables that seemed to float on impossibly delicate legs. Jacob made these in the 1970s and early 80s, David explained. After Sam left, Jacob poured himself into his work. I think creating beautiful things helped him deal with the pain of losing his son to the outside world. Did Sam ever return to visit? Occasionally, especially near the end of Jacob's life. But the relationship was strained. Sam had become successful in the English world, but success couldn't bridge the gap that his leaving had created. Margaret studied a small jewelry box that bore Samuel's initials carved discreetly into the bottom. Even as a teenager, his craftsmanship had been extraordinary. She thought about the wooden bird he had carved for her as an 11-year-old and marveled at how his skills had developed. Mr. Schlabach, do you know what happened to Samuel after his father died? Jacob passed in 1995. Sam came for the funeral, stayed a few days to help his mother with arrangements. After that, I lost track of him. His mother Rebecca moved to live with relatives in Pennsylvania. She died about 10 years ago. Margaret felt a pang of sadness for Samuel's losses. Both parents gone, and from the sound of it, he had been largely estranged from his family due to his decision to leave the Amish community. David walked her to a display case near the front of the store. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the early 1990s, featuring a young man receiving an award for excellence in furniture design. The caption identified him as Sam Yoder of Columbus, winner of the Ohio Craftsmen's Guild highest honor. That's Samuel, David said with obvious pride. He found a way to honor his father's legacy while making his own path in the world. Margaret studied the photograph carefully. Samuel Mao Sam was in his 30s in the picture, with the same gentle eyes she remembered from childhood, but stronger features and more confident bearing. He stood beside an elegant rocking chair that seemed to capture movement in solid wood. May I have a copy of this article? Of course. I'm glad someone is still interested in Sam's story. He was a remarkable young man who faced some difficult choices. The drive back to Millbrook gave Margaret time to process what she had learned. Samuel had succeeded brilliantly in the outside world, winning recognition for his artistic talents, while building what appeared to be a successful business. But success had come at the cost of his relationship with his family and faith community. how much of his decision to leave the Amish faith had been influenced by the injustice his family had suffered in Millbrook. Had the experience of being wrongly accused and driven from their home made Samuel question whether any community could truly accept those who were different. That evening, Margaret shared her discoveries with Ruth, who listened with growing sadness to the story of Samuel's estrangement from his family. "It's possible," Ruth said thoughtfully, "that what happened in Millbrook taught Samuel that he would always be an outsider in traditional communities. Maybe leaving the Amish faith seemed like his only path to finding acceptance in the wider world." Margaret considered this possibility, feeling the weight of her community's legacy of harm. How many other bright young people had been driven away from their roots by prejudice and narrow-mindedness? "I'm more determined than ever to find him," she said. "He deserves to know that not everyone in Millbrook was part of the injustice. And he deserves to hear the truth about what really happened." Ruth reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. "You're doing the right thing, even if it's difficult. Sometimes healing old wounds is the most important work we can do." As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she studied the newspaper photo of Sam Yoder receiving his award. He looked successful and confident, but she thought she could see something guarded in his expression, as if he had learned early to protect himself from disappointment. Tomorrow she would continue the search, following whatever leads might bring her closer to the man Samuel had become. She owed him the truth, an apology, and the acknowledgement that his family's innocence was finally recognized by at least one person from the community that had wronged them. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret had been searching online for any recent mentions of Sam Yoder when her phone rang. It was Mrs. Henderson from the community center, her voice excited and slightly breathless. "Margaret, dear, you need to come see something immediately. I was organizing some old newspapers for the Historical Society when I found something remarkable about your Samuel." Margaret arrived at the community center to find Mrs. Henderson waiting with a stack of recent newspapers spread across a table. The elderly woman's eyes were bright with discovery. "Look at this," she said, pointing to an article from the Columbus Dispatch dated just 6 months earlier. "I almost missed it because the name threw me off at first." Margaret leaned over the newspaper and felt her world shift. The headline read, "Anonymous benefactor reveals identity after decades of charitable giving." Below, it was a photograph of a distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and kind eyes that she recognized immediately, despite the passage of nearly 60 years. "Samuel Alexander," she whispered, reading the name in the caption. "Keep reading," Mrs. Henderson urged gently. The article revealed that Samuel Alexander, a successful businessman and philanthropist from Columbus, had been secretly funding children's programs across rural Ohio for over 30 years. His donations had built playgrounds, funded art programs, provided scholarships for underprivileged students, and supported community centers in small towns throughout the state. Mr. Alexander, who legally changed his name from Sam Yoder in 1985, explained that his philanthropy was inspired by his own difficult childhood experiences. The article continued, "Growing up, I learned that children are often the most vulnerable members of any community, especially those who are different or marginalized. I wanted to ensure that other children would have opportunities and support that might not otherwise be available to them." Margaret's hands trembled as she continued reading. The article described Samuel's business success. He had built a furniture and design company that created custom pieces for luxury hotels and corporate clients across the Midwest. But what struck her most was the scope of his charitable work. According to Foundation records, the article stated, Mr. Alexander's anonymous donations have totaled more than $2 million over the past 3 decades, focusing primarily on programs that serve children in rural communities. Mrs. Henderson pointed to a sidebar that listed some of the specific programs Samuel had funded. Margaret's breath caught as she saw familiar names: the Millbrook Community Center's Children's Art Program, the County Library's Literacy Initiative, even scholarships at the local high school. "He's been helping Millbrook all along," Margaret said in amazement. "Our own community, and we never knew." "There's more," Mrs. Henderson said, turning to another page. "Look at this quote." Margaret read aloud. When asked why he chose to remain anonymous for so long, Mr. Alexander said, "I learned as a child that kindness works best when it comes without expectation of recognition or return. A little girl once helped me when I needed it most, and she didn't do it for praise or attention. She did it because it was the right thing to do. I've tried to honor that lesson throughout my life." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. After all these years, Samuel had remembered her simple act of kindness, and it had shaped his entire approach to helping others. The ripples from that moment on the playground had indeed spread farther than she could ever have imagined. "Margaret," Mrs. Henderson said gently, "there's something else you should see." She pulled out one more newspaper clipping, this one more recent. It was an announcement about the dedication of a new children's center in Millbrook, scheduled for the following month. The center was being funded by an anonymous benefactor, and the facility would provide after-school programs, art classes, and mentoring for children from all backgrounds. "The center is being named the Ruth Callahan Children's Center," Mrs. Henderson said softly, "in honor of your sister's years of volunteer work with local children." Margaret stared at the announcement. In shock, Samuel was honoring Ruth, whom he had barely known as a child. How had he learned about Ruth's volunteer work? How long had he been quietly watching over their family and community? "I don't understand," Margaret said. "How would he know about Ruth's work with children?" Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly. "Samuel Alexander has been very thorough in his research about Millbrook. I suspect he's known more about what's been happening here than any of us realized." Margaret drove home in a daze, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had discovered. Samuel hadn't just survived the injustice done to his family. He had transformed it into a mission of compassion that had touched thousands of lives. The shy, wounded boy who had been driven from Millbrook had become a man dedicated to ensuring other children would be treated with kindness and given opportunities to thrive. At home, Ruth was waiting in the sunroom, looking more alert than she had in days. "You found something significant," Ruth observed, studying Margaret's expression. Margaret showed her sister the newspaper articles, watching Ruth's face transform as she absorbed the magnitude of Samuel's story. When Ruth finished reading, she was quiet for a long time. "He forgave us," Ruth said finally. "More than that, he's been taking care of our community even after what we did to his family. Ruth, the Children's Center is being named for you. Somehow, he knows about your volunteer work." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "All those years I spent reading to children at the library, helping with school programs, I never imagined anyone was paying attention. Samuel was paying attention. He's been watching over Millbrook all along, making sure children here have opportunities and support." Margaret felt a profound sense of humility wash over her. While she had spent decades as a teacher, helping one classroom of students at a time, Samuel had been quietly transforming the lives of children across entire communities. His response to injustice had been to create justice for others. "The dedication ceremony is next month," Margaret said. "He'll be there." Ruth nodded slowly. "You'll finally have the chance to thank him for remembering your kindness, and to apologize for our family's role in what happened to his." That evening, Margaret sat in her childhood bedroom, holding Samuel's carved bird and rereading his letter from the oak tree. His words about kindness being like pebbles thrown into a pond had proven prophetic beyond anything she could have imagined. The ripples from her simple act of compassion had spread across decades and touched thousands of lives. But more than that, Samuel had chosen to respond to cruelty with kindness, to injustice with generosity, to exile with love for the very community that had rejected his family. It was a level of grace that left Margaret both humbled and inspired. She thought about her own life, her teaching career, her dedication to her students, her efforts to make a difference in young people's lives. It had been meaningful work. But seeing the scope of Samuel's quiet philanthropy made her wonder if she had thought too small, acted too cautiously. The dedication ceremony would give her the chance to finally thank Samuel for the lesson in kindness he had taught her as a child, and to apologize for the injustice he had suffered at the hands of her community and family. But perhaps more importantly, it would give her the opportunity to learn from the remarkable man he had become. Margaret fell asleep that night thinking about the children who would soon benefit from the Ruth Callahan Children's Center, and about the quiet man whose childhood pain had been transformed into a lifetime of healing for others. Tomorrow, she would begin planning what she wanted to say to Samuel Alexander. When they finally met again after 58 years, the invitation arrived. 3 days later, delivered by hand to Margaret's door. The envelope was cream-colored and formal, with her name written in elegant script. Inside, embossed on heavy paper, was an invitation to the dedication ceremony for the Ruth Callahan Children's Center, scheduled for Saturday, June 15th at 2:00 in the afternoon. At the bottom of the invitation, in the same careful handwriting she recognized from Samuel's childhood letter, was a personal note. Dear Margaret, I hope you will be able to attend. I have been looking forward to this reunion for many years. With gratitude and warm regards, Samuel Alexander. Margaret's hand shook as she read the note. Samuel knew she was in Millbrook. He had been aware of her presence all along, perhaps had even been waiting for her to discover his identity. The realization filled her with a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy. Ruth's health had taken another turn for the worse that week. The pain medication was making her sleep more frequently, and Dr. Patterson had quietly increased the frequency of his visits. Margaret knew they were approaching the end, though she tried not to dwell on the timeline. Ruth had good moments and bad ones, but she remained determined to attend the dedication ceremony. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Ruth said when Margaret showed her the invitation. Samuel Alexander wants to honor me with this center, and I intend to be there to thank him properly. Margaret spent the following weeks helping Ruth conserve her energy for the ceremony while managing her own emotional preparation for meeting Samuel again. She had written and rewritten what she wanted to say to him, but nothing seemed adequate to express the complexity of her feelings: gratitude for his forgiveness, shame for her family's role in his suffering, and admiration for the man he had become. The community was buzzing with excitement about the new children's center. Word had spread about the identity of the anonymous benefactor, and many residents were amazed to learn that Samuel Yoder, the quiet Amish boy who had been driven from their town decades earlier, had become their secret guardian angel. Margaret was both gratified and troubled by the community's response. People were eager to celebrate Samuel's generosity, but few seemed willing to acknowledge the injustice that had driven his family away. It was easier to focus on his success and philanthropy than to confront their own complicity in his childhood. Mrs. Henderson had organized a small exhibit about Samuel's life for the community center, using the photographs and articles Margaret had helped gather. The display told the story of his transformation from rejected outsider to beloved benefactor, though it diplomatically avoided dwelling on the specific circumstances of his family's departure from Millbrook. On the Tuesday before the ceremony, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Patterson had come to check on Ruth, but he lingered after his examination, clearly wanting to discuss something beyond medical matters. Margaret, I feel I should tell you something about Mr. Alexander's generosity to our community, he said as they sat in the kitchen while Ruth napped. He's been funding more than just children's programs. Margaret looked at him with curiosity. What do you mean? For the past 15 years, someone has been anonymously paying for medical care for families who couldn't afford it. Cancer treatments, emergency surgeries, prescription medications for elderly patients on fixed incomes. Dr. Patterson paused, his expression thoughtful. I always wondered who was behind it, but the payments came through a foundation with strict anonymity requirements. Samuel was paying for medical care? Not just here in Millbrook, but in several rural communities across the region. Hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years, maybe more. Families who would have gone bankrupt or gone without treatment received the care they needed. Margaret felt a new wave of admiration for Samuel's quiet generosity. He had been healing the community that had wounded him in ways that went far beyond children's programs and scholarships. Dr. Patterson, did he ever specify who should receive this assistance? The Foundation's instructions were simple. Help should be given to families in need, regardless of their background, religion, or circumstances. No one was to be excluded based on differences or past conflicts. The doctor's meaning was clear. Samuel had ensured that even families who might have been involved in his family's persecution would receive help if they needed it done. As the day of the ceremony approached, Margaret found herself thinking constantly about what she would say to Samuel. How do you apologize for a community's sins? How do you thank someone for transforming cruelty into kindness? How do you acknowledge a grace so profound that it had quietly healed wounds you didn't even know still existed? Ruth was having a particularly difficult morning on the day of the ceremony. The pain was severe, and she was weak from lack of appetite. Margaret was prepared to help her sister skip the event, but Ruth was adamant about attending. This may be my only chance to meet Samuel Alexander, Ruth said with characteristic determination. I won't let pain keep me from thanking him for what he's done. Margaret helped her sister dress carefully in her best blue dress, the one she had worn to church for special occasions. Ruth moved slowly but with dignity, her silver hair arranged neatly and a small pearl necklace adding elegance to her appearance. The ceremony was being held on the site where the new children's center would open in the fall. A small stage had been erected, surrounded by folding chairs for the community members who had gathered to witness the dedication. Margaret estimated that nearly 200 people were in attendance, an impressive turnout for a town the size of Millbrook. As was. Margaret helped Ruth to their seats in the front row. She scanned the crowd for any sign of Samuel. She wasn't sure she would recognize him after so many years, but something told her she would know him when she saw him. Mayor Williams opened the ceremony with remarks about the importance of community investment in children's futures. Mrs. Henderson spoke about the history of youth programs in Millbrook and the difference the new center would make. Several parents shared stories about how existing programs had helped their children develop confidence and skills. Then Mayor Williams called Samuel Alexander to the stage. Margaret's breath caught as a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and gentle eyes walked to the podium. Despite the passage of nearly 60 years, she recognized him immediately. The boy who had stood so quietly while she tied his shoelaces had grown into a man who carried himself with quiet confidence and unmistakable kindness. Samuel, she found it difficult to think of him as anything else, looked out over the crowd with a slight smile. His eyes found Margaret's almost immediately, and he nodded in recognition before beginning to speak. Thank you all for being here today, he said, his voice carrying the same gentle tone she remembered from childhood, though deeper now and resonant with years of experience. This is a very special day for me, returning to the community where I learned some of life's most important lessons. He paused, looking directly at Margaret and Ruth. I learned here that kindness is a choice we make every day, and that even the smallest acts of compassion can change the course of a life. I also learned that communities are made up of individuals, each capable of both cruelty and grace. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes as Samuel continued his remarks. He spoke about the importance of ensuring that all children feel valued and supported, regardless of their differences. He talked about the power of education and creativity to transform young lives. Throughout his speech, he maintained the tone of someone who had found peace with his past while remaining committed to improving the future. When he finished speaking, Samuel stepped down from the stage and walked directly to where Margaret and Ruth were sitting. The crowd watched in respectful silence as he approached. "Margaret," he said simply, extending his hand to help her stand. "It's wonderful to see you again." Up close, Margaret could see that Samuel's eyes still held the same warmth she remembered from childhood, though they were now marked by the wisdom and strength that came from a life well lived. He turned to Ruth, who was struggling to stand, despite her illness. "And you must be Ruth," he said gently, taking her hand carefully. "I've heard wonderful things about your work with children over the years. It's an honor to dedicate this center in your name." Ruth's voice was barely a whisper, but her words carried deep emotion. "Mr. Alexander, I need to apologize for what our community did to your family, what our father did. It was wrong, and I've carried that shame for many years." Samuel's expression grew even more gentle. "Ruth, you were a child when those events occurred. You bear no responsibility for the actions of adults. Besides," he smiled slightly, "if those difficulties hadn't happened, I might never have learned to look for ways to help other children avoid similar pain." Margaret found her voice at last. "Samuel, I've been searching for you because I needed to tell you that we know the truth now. We know your family was innocent, and we know who really took that money. I wanted you to hear that from someone who was there." Samuel nodded slowly. "I've known the truth for many years, Margaret. My concern was never about clearing my family's name for our own sake, but about ensuring that future children wouldn't suffer from the same kind of prejudice and fear." As the three of them stood together surrounded by the community that had once rejected Samuel's family, Margaret realized that this moment represented more than just a reunion or an apology. It was a demonstration of how forgiveness and grace could transform even the deepest wounds into sources of healing for others. The formal ceremony continued around them, but Margaret felt as though she and Samuel and Ruth existed in their own quiet space where past and present, hurt and healing, memory and hope converged into something larger than any of them could have imagined on that long-ago day. While a little girl knelt in the dust to help a shy boy with his shoelaces, the ceremony concluded with the Panea's symbolic groundbreaking for the Children's Center. But Margaret's attention remained focused on the quiet conversation she was having with Samuel. Ruth had been seated in a nearby chair, conserving her strength while listening to their exchange with obvious emotion. After the crowd began to disperse, Samuel suggested they continue their conversation somewhere more private. "Would you mind if we walked to the old creek?" he asked. "I'd like to see if the oak tree is still there." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. The oak tree, where she had found his letter and carved bird. Did Samuel know about her discovery, or was he simply drawn to revisit a place that had held meaning for him as a child? They made their way slowly across the field behind the school, Ruth leaning heavily on Margaret's arm, but insisting she could manage the walk. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, and the air carried the scent of early summer flowers. The oak tree stood unchanged, its massive trunk bearing the scars of decades, but still strong and vital. Samuel approached it with obvious familiarity, running his hand over the bark where he had once carved his initials alongside dozens of other children. "I used to come here when things became difficult at school," he said quietly. "It was a place where I could think and be alone with my thoughts." Margaret watched him carefully, wondering if he would mention the hiding place he had created in the tree's roots. Instead, Samuel turned to face both sisters, his expression becoming more serious. I want you both to know that I've never held anger toward your community or your family," he began. "What happened in 1967 was painful, yes, but it taught me something valuable about human nature and the importance of choosing compassion over fear." Ruth spoke up from her chair, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "But Samuel, surely, you must have felt angry at the time. You were just a child, and you were treated so unfairly." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "I was confused more than angry. I couldn't understand why people would rather believe something bad about us than take the time to know who we really were. But my parents helped me see that fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally do." He paused, looking back at the oak tree. "My father told me that the true test of a person's character isn't how they behave when life is easy, but how they choose to respond when they're faced with injustice or pain. He said we could let bitterness grow in our hearts, or we could use our experiences to become more compassionate toward others who suffer." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. "Your father sounds like a wise man." He was, and so was my mother. They both died believing that people are fundamentally good, even when circumstances bring out their worst impulses. Samuel's voice carried a note of sadness. "I miss them both, and I regret that my decision to leave the Amish faith caused them pain." "Did you ever reconcile with them?" Ruth asked gently. "In the end, yes. My father understood that I needed to find my own path, even if it wasn't the one he would have chosen for me. My mother always said that God had given me talents that were meant to be shared with the world, not hidden away." Samuel looked directly at Margaret. "But you played a role in my healing too, Margaret. That day when you helped me with my shoelaces, it showed me that not everyone in Millbrook was cruel. Your kindness gave me hope that I could find good people wherever I went." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the weight of his words. "Samuel, I had no idea that such a small gesture would mean so much to you." "Sometimes the most important things we do are the ones that seem smallest at the time," he replied. "Your kindness planted a seed that grew into everything I've tried to do since then." Ruth leaned forward in her chair. "Samuel, can you tell us about the Children's Center? Why did you choose to name it after me?" Samuel's expression grew tender. "Ruth, for the past 20 years, I've been quietly keeping track of what was happening in Millbrook. I learned about your volunteer work with children, how you spent countless hours reading to them at the library, helping with school programs, organizing activities that made them feel valued and loved." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I realized that while I was helping children from a distance through anonymous donations, you were here doing the daily work of caring for them personally. The center should bear your name because you've been the real children's advocate in this community all along." Ruth wiped tears from her eyes. "I never imagined anyone was paying attention to what I was doing. I just enjoyed being around children and wanted to help however I could." "That's exactly why your name belongs on the center," Samuel said. "You helped because it was the right thing to do, not because you expected recognition or praise." That's the same spirit I remember from Margaret's kindness all those years ago. As the sun began to set over the peaceful creek, Margaret realized they were experiencing something profound, a moment where past wounds were being transformed into future healing, where childhood pain was being redeemed through adult grace. And understanding as the evening shadows lengthened around the oak tree. Samuel reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something wrapped in soft cloth. Margaret recognized the careful way he handled it, reminiscent of how he had once treasured his small possessions as a child. "I brought something I thought you might like to see," he said, unwrapping a small wooden carving. It was another bird, similar to the one Margaret had found in the tree's hollow, but more sophisticated in its craftsmanship. This one appeared to be taking flight, its wings spread wide and every feather rendered in exquisite detail. "I carved this last week, thinking about today," Samuel said, placing it gently in Margaret's hands. I wanted to give you something that represented what your kindness meant to me. Freedom to soar beyond the limitations others tried to place on me." Margaret turned the carving over in her hands, marveling at the skill and artistry. "Samuel, it's beautiful, but you've already given me so much by showing me what one moment of kindness can become." "That's just it, Margaret. You didn't just show me kindness that day. You showed me dignity. When you knelt down to help me, you didn't act like you were doing charity for someone beneath you. You treated me as an equal, as a friend worth helping." Ruth spoke up from her chair, her voice thoughtful. "I think that's the difference between real kindness and mere pity. Real kindness recognizes the humanity in another person." Samuel nodded emphatically. "Exactly. And that recognition changed how I saw myself and how I believed others could see me. Instead of accepting that I would always be an outsider, I learned to look for the people who could see past differences, to the person underneath." Margaret found herself thinking about her years as a teacher, wondering how many of her students had needed that same recognition of their dignity and worth. "Do you think that's why you focus so much of your philanthropy on children?" "Children are the most vulnerable to being treated as less than they are," Samuel replied. "They often can't advocate for themselves, and they absorb messages about their worth from how adults treat them. I wanted to make sure that children who were different, or struggling, or marginalized would have adults in their lives who saw their potential." As they talked, Margaret noticed that someone had approached quietly from the direction of the school. Mrs. Henderson was walking toward them, carrying a small camera and wearing an expression of gentle purpose. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said as she reached them, "but I wondered if you might allow me to take a photograph. This moment, the three of you here together after all these years, it seems like something that should be remembered." Margaret looked at Samuel and Ruth, both of whom nodded their agreement. They arranged themselves near the oak tree, with Ruth seated and Margaret and Samuel standing on either side of her. As Mrs. Henderson prepared to take the picture, Samuel reached into his pocket again. "Wait," he said, pulling out the original photograph that had started Margaret's search. "I've carried this with me for 58 years. Margaret, I wonder if you'd mind recreating that moment, just for a moment." Margaret's breath caught as she saw the faded photograph, the same one she had found in Ruth's attic. "You've had this all along?" "My mother saved it from my school things before we left Millbrook. She told me to keep it as a reminder that there were good people in the world, even in places where we had experienced pain." Without hesitation, Margaret knelt beside Samuel's chair as Mrs. Henderson had positioned him for the photograph. But instead of tying his shoes, she simply took his hand in both of hers, looking up at him with the same direct, caring gaze she had given him as a child. Mrs. Henderson's camera captured the moment two people in their 70s, recreating an act of childhood kindness, but with the depth of understanding that decades of life experience had brought them. Behind them, Ruth watched with tears of joy in her eyes, and the ancient oak tree stood as silent witness to the healing of old wounds. When they stood again, Samuel kept hold of Margaret's hand for a moment longer. "Thank you," he said simply, "for then and for now, and for spending all these weeks searching for me so that we could have this conversation." "Thank you for becoming the man you became," Margaret replied, "for showing me what it looks like to transform pain into purpose." Ruth struggled to stand, and both Margaret and Samuel moved to assist her. "I need to say something," she said, her voice carrying surprising strength. "Samuel, watching you here today, seeing the grace with which you've responded to injustice, has taught me something important about forgiveness. You've shown me that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or excusing wrong behavior. It means choosing not to let other people's failures define your own character." Samuel's eyes brightened with emotion. "That may be the wisest thing anyone has said to me in years, Ruth." As the last light of day faded around them, the three of them made their way back toward the cars. Margaret realized that this conversation had given her something she hadn't even known. She was looking for not just closure about the past, but inspiration for whatever years remained ahead of her. Samuel had shown her that it was never too late to transform understanding into action. Memory into mission. The new photograph Mrs. Henderson had taken would serve as a bridge between past and present, a symbol of how time could heal wounds and how kindness, once planted, could continue growing across decades. 6 months after the dedication ceremony, Margaret stood in the bright, cheerful classroom of the Ruth Callahan Children's Center, watching a group of 8-year-olds work on their art projects. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating paintings and drawings that covered the walls in a rainbow of childhood creativity. Ruth had passed away peacefully in her sleep, just 2 weeks after meeting Samuel, as if their reunion had given her permission to let go. Her final days had been filled with a contentment Margaret had rarely seen in her sister, a sense that important business had been completed and old wounds had been healed. The funeral had been attended by more people than Margaret had expected, including many children and parents whose lives Ruth had touched through her years of quiet service. Samuel had spoken at the service, describing Ruth as a woman who had understood that the most important work in any community was nurturing its children. Now, as Margaret watched the children in the center that bore her sister's name, she felt Ruth's presence in every laugh and every moment of discovery. The building itself was beautiful, designed with large, open spaces that felt welcoming rather than institutional, with natural light and warm colors that made both children and adults feel at home. Samuel had insisted that Margaret be involved in planning the center's programs. Recognizing her decades of experience as an educator, she had initially planned to return to Cleveland after Ruth's funeral, but found herself drawn to stay in Millbrook and help establish the programs that would serve local children. "Mrs. Chun," called out a small voice. Margaret turned to see Emma Rodriguez, a shy 7-year-old who reminded her of Samuel at that age, holding up a drawing of a bird in flight. "That's beautiful, Emma," Margaret said, kneeling down to examine the artwork more closely. "Tell me about your bird." "It's flying to find its family," Emma explained seriously. "My abuela says that sometimes families get separated, but love always helps them find each other again." Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her throat. Emma's family had recently immigrated from El Salvador, and the little girl was still adjusting to a new language and culture. Like Samuel decades earlier, she was learning to navigate a world where being different sometimes made her a target for other children's cruelty. "Your abuela sounds very wise," Margaret said gently, "and your bird looks like it knows exactly where it's going." As the afternoon progressed, Margaret moved among the children, offering encouragement and assistance with their projects. She had discovered that working with younger children was different from teaching high school students, but equally rewarding. These children were still forming their understanding of the world, still learning whether it was a place where they could feel safe and valued. At the end of the day, after the children had been picked up by parents and caregivers, Margaret sat in her small office reviewing the foundation documents that had arrived that morning. Samuel had established a formal partnership between his foundation and the Children's Center, ensuring its programs would be funded for decades to come. But more than that, he had created something he called the Margaret and Samuel Foundation for children, dedicated to replicating the Millbrook model in other rural communities. The foundation's mission statement, written in Samuel's careful handwriting, began, "We believe that every child deserves to be seen, valued, and supported, regardless of their background, abilities, or circumstances. We commit to creating environments where kindness is practiced, differences are celebrated, and every young person has the opportunity to discover their unique gifts." Margaret smiled as she read the words, hearing echoes of the boy who had written to her from his hiding place in the oak tree. Samuel's childhood wisdom about kindness, being like pebbles in a pond, had become the guiding principle for a foundation that would help thousands of children across multiple states A soft knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Samuel stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the gentle smile she had come to treasure over the past months. "How was your first week?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Challenging and wonderful," Margaret replied honestly. "I'd forgotten how much energy it takes to keep up with young children, but I'd also forgotten how much hope they carry." Samuel nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I stopped by to see how the integration with the county library program was going. Mrs. Patterson says the children are excited about the new reading initiative." They spent the next hour discussing plans for expanding the center's programs, including a mentorship component that would pair older children with younger ones and an art therapy program for children who had experienced trauma. Samuel listened to Margaret's ideas with the same attentiveness she remembered from their childhood, treating every suggestion as worthy of serious consideration. As evening approached, they walked together through the center's main activity room, where the walls displayed not only children's artwork but also photographs documenting the center's first months of operation. Margaret paused in front of the picture Mrs. Henderson had taken of them by the oak tree, now framed and holding a place of honor near the entrance. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't helped you that day?" Margaret asked. Samuel considered the question thoughtfully. "I think I would have found kindness somewhere else, eventually. But it might have taken longer, and it might not have shaped my understanding of compassion in quite the same way." He paused, looking around the room filled with evidence of young creativity and growth. "What I know for certain is that your kindness taught me to look for goodness in unexpected places and people. That lesson has guided everything I've done since." Margaret felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she surveyed the space they had created together. Children from all backgrounds, Amish, Hispanic, African American, white, came together here each day to learn, play, and grow. The center had become exactly what Samuel had envisioned, a place where differences were not just tolerated but celebrated, where every child could feel valued and supported. As they prepared to leave for the evening, Margaret noticed a small boy's drawing posted near the door. It showed 2 children on a playground, one helping the other tie his shoes. At the bottom, in careful first-grade handwriting, were the words, "Being kind makes the world better." She smiled, thinking of the ripples that continued to spread from one small act of compassion on a long-ago autumn day. Samuel had been right. Kindness was indeed like a pebble thrown into a pond, its effects reaching far beyond what the eye could see. Outside, the early autumn air carried the scent of changing leaves and the promise of new seasons. Margaret and Samuel walked to their cars together, comfortable in the friendship they had rediscovered and the shared purpose that had grown from their reunion. Tomorrow would bring new children to nurture, new opportunities to plant seeds of kindness, and new chances to prove that even the smallest gestures of compassion could change the world, one young heart at a time.